So, welcome to Adolescent Psychology, Lecture 1. This is going to be the first of a series of lectures that we're going to have during this course. Not every week will there be a lecture, but when we do have a lecture, I suggest that you watch the lecture from start to finish. Take some notes as you watch the lecture because the material that I cover is likely to be on the quiz for that week or on the midterm or on the final. Let's get started with this first lecture. So in the spring of 2015, the world watched closely as a young man named Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, and I may not be saying his name correctly, but I put the spelling up on the slide for you to see. He went on trial for the Boston Marathon bombing. The question before the jury was not whether Tsarnaev had committed the crime, because he admitted as much, but whether he should receive a sentence of life in prison or the death penalty. Tsarnaev was 19 when the bombing took place. Among the witnesses that were called by Tsarnaev's defense team was Jay Geed. Again, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, so I put the spelling up on the slide. But Jay Geed was a prominent expert in adolescent brain development. Geed testified that recent studies showed that the brain was still maturing during the late teens and early 20s. Building on Geed's testimony, Tsarnaev's attorneys argued that people this age lack the ability to stand up to a more powerful peer, like an older brother, and that this immaturity made Tsarnaev less than fully responsible for his behavior, and accordingly, less deserving of capital punishment, of the death penalty. So if you remember, his brother and him were involved in this bombing. So, is there something to what Geed testified about? Is there something about having a powerful peer like an older brother affecting Dzhokhar's decision making? Is the brain development affecting his ability to make decisions? So the jury on the case rejected the arguments that were made. And on May 15th, 2015, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was sentenced to death. Since then, they have filed an appeal, which was expected, but they're going to continue to argue, I'm sure, on these issues. Although advances in adolescent brain science did not sway the jury in the Boston Marathon bombing case, the science of adolescent development is changing the way in which we think about this stage of life. Historically, and pretty much around the world, we have drawn a legal, and I'm stressing the word legal, boundary between adolescence and adulthood at age 18. We've just decided on that number. That's the number, 18. You are legally an adult on your 18th birthday. You even hear parents saying at age 18, you're out of the house, that kind of idea, because you're an adult at age 18. So it may not even just be a legal definition. It may be a little bit of our societal idea. Age 18, you're an adult. Even though in the United States, there are some things people are permitted to do at an earlier age, like driving. And then there's also things that are prohibited until several years after 18, like purchasing alcohol. But what if the brain is still maturing in the early 20s? What if things like impulse control or the ability to fully think through the future consequences of one's decisions are still developing into the mid-20s? Should this change how we define adulthood under the law? Should we change it? Should we make it 25 as a legal age of adulthood? This question is one that I'm particularly interested in because I work with juvenile offenders, juveniles who are incarcerated. And I'm wondering, does a 15-year-old, should they be held accountable in the same way as a 20-year-old or a 25-year-old or a 30-year-old? Okay. Where should we draw the line between adolescence and adulthood? It's not just an abstract academic exercise. How we answer this question has far reaching ramifications for society and, of course, for teenagers. At what age should a pregnant adolescent be able to obtain an abortion without her parents' permission? How old should individuals have to be to see a psychologist or have cosmetic surgery without their parents knowing? Have we picked the right ages in deciding who can drive, see R-rated movies, or buy cigarettes? And how should we respond to young offenders? Do the adult crime, do the adult time? It may sound fair from the perspective of crime victims, but does it make sense in light of what we know about adolescent development? When he committed the Boston Marathon bombing, was Dzhokhar Tsarnaev an adolescent or an adult? So, studies of adolescent brain development have revealed that the brain continues to mature well into the mid-20s. The research was used in several U.S. Supreme Court cases where the court ruled that adolescents should not be punished as severely as adults, even when they have been convicted of the same crimes. But some advocates for youth have worried that this same research can be used to limit what teenagers are allowed to do, such as drive or seek an abortion without their parents' knowledge. How would you respond to someone who, on the basis of this research, says that if adolescents are too young to be punished like adults, they are too young to be treated like adults in other ways as well? What is the nature of adolescents' identity development in a changing world? How should society deal with the problems of youth unemployment, underage drinking, teenage pregnancy, juvenile crime? What is the best way to prepare young people for adulthood? Answering these questions is the nature of this course. We're going to explore what it means to be an adolescent, how society views adolescence differently in different cultures, how the nature of adolescence itself has changed over the years, what are the physical changes, how does our brain mature, how does the relationship with others change, and so on. Okay. So the boundaries of adolescence. The word adolescence is derived from the Latin word that I have on the screen called adolescere. Although I have no idea if that's actually how you pronounce it in Latin. I do not speak Latin, nor have I ever taken a class in Latin. But anyway, the term, that word, derived from Latin, means to grow into adulthood. In all societies, adolescence is a time of growing up, of moving from the immaturity of childhood into the maturity of adulthood, of preparation for the future. Adolescence is a period of transitions, biological, psychological, social, economic. During adolescence, individuals become interested in sex and biologically capable of having children. They become wiser, more sophisticated, and better able to make their own decisions. They become more self-aware, more independent, and more concerned about what the future holds. Over time, they are permitted to work, to get married, to drive, and to vote. Think for a moment about how much you've changed between when you finished elementary school and when you graduated from high school. I'm sure you'll agree that the changes you went through were pretty remarkable. So if we're going to define adolescence, you can use what I have on the screen, but I'm also going to read a definition that I have in a book. The stage of development that begins with puberty and ends when individuals make the transition into adult roles, roughly speaking, from about 10 until the early 20s. And I'm going to repeat that. The stage of development that begins with puberty and ends when individuals make the transition into adult roles, roughly speaking, from about 10 to the early 20s. There are a variety of boundaries that we can draw between childhood and adolescence and between adolescence and adulthood. And I'm going to show you a table. So hopefully you can see the table. And there's a list of perspectives on the left, and in the middle, when adolescence begins, and then according to that perspective, when adolescence ends. As you can see, there are a variety of boundaries we might draw between childhood and adolescence and between adolescence and adulthood. Whereas a biologist would place a great deal of emphasis on the attainment and completion of puberty, an attorney would look instead at important age breaks designated by law. And an educator might draw attention to differences between students enrolled in different grades in schools. Is a biologically mature fifth grader an adolescent or a child? So if in fifth grade you've already gone through puberty, do we consider them an adolescent even though many of their peers are not quite there yet? Is a 20-year-old student who lives at home an adolescent or an adult? There are no right or wrong answers to these questions. It all depends on the boundaries that we use to define the period. Determining the beginning and ending of adolescence is more a matter of opinion than of absolute fact. Okay, so there's nothing factual. This is like a construct that we have come up with as a society, and through different lenses we view it differently. Rather than argue about which boundaries are the correct ones, it makes more sense to think of development during adolescence as involving a series of transitions from immaturity into maturity. Some of these passages are long, and some are short, some are smooth, and others are rough. And not all of them occur at the same time. Consequently, it is quite possible, and perhaps even likely, that an individual will mature in some respects before he matures in others. The various aspects of adolescence have different beginnings and different endings for every individual. An individual can be a child in some ways, an adolescent in other ways, and an adult in still other ways. For the purposes of this class, we are going to define adolescence as beginning with puberty, ending when young people make the transition into adult roles, roughly from age 10 to the early 20s, like I mentioned on the earlier slide. Okay. Although at one time adolescence may have been synonymous with the teenage years, so people used to think adolescence is age 13 to 19. That adolescent period has lengthened considerably in the past 100 years, both because physical maturation occurs earlier, so people are going through puberty much earlier than 13, even though it used to be more around that age, right? But also because so many individuals are delaying entering into work and marriage until their mid-20s. So it's no longer 13 to 19 how we view it as a society. It's a bigger range, so from age 10 to about early 20s. Now, early adolescence, if we're going to divide adolescence into like subcategories, early adolescence we would say is from ages 10 to 13. That's corresponding roughly to junior high or middle school years. Then there's middle adolescence. It's roughly ages 14 to 17, and this corresponds to your high school years. Then there's late adolescence, and it's corresponding approximately to the college years. And, we understand not everyone who goes to college at that time, but it's just that traditional age when people graduate high school and might start college at that time. And then emerging adulthood is the period spanning roughly age 18 to 25, could be early to mid 20s. It's a period during which individuals make the transition from adolescence to adulthood. Because so much psychological and social growth takes place during adolescence, most social scientists and practitioners view adolescence as composed of a series of phases rather than one single stage. The 11-year-old whose time and energy is wrapped up in hip-hop, Facebook, baseball, has little in common with the 21-year-old who is involved in a serious romance, worried about the pressures in school, looking for an affordable apartment. So social scientists who study adolescence differentiated these periods into early adolescence, middle adolescence, late adolescence. In discussing development during adolescence, we'll need to be sensitive not only to differences between adolescence and childhood or between adolescence and adulthood, but also to differences among the various phases of adolescence itself. Some writers have suggested that new phase of life called emerging adulthood. However, despite the popularity of this idea in the mass media, there is little evidence that emerging adulthood is a universal stage or that the majority of young people in their mid-20s are in some sort of psychological or social limbo between being an adolescent and an adulthood. An adult, I should say. Indeed, what's most striking about the transition from adolescence to adulthood today is just how many different pathways there are. Some individuals spend their 20s single, dependent on their parents, bouncing from job to job, while others leave adolescence and go straight into marriage, full-time employment, and economic independence. So it's kind of this various ways we do it in our society. Next slide, and our last slide for this lecture, the fundamental changes in adolescence. What, if anything, is distinctive about adolescence as a period of development? According to this man named John Hill in 1983, he said, and you don't need to know his name. It's not an important name. It's not like Freud or Adler in psychology or anything like that. But John Hill, he said that there's 3 features of adolescent development that give the period its special flavor and significance. The onset of puberty, that's 1, the onset of puberty. Number 2, the emergence of more advanced thinking abilities. And number 3, the transition into new roles in society. These 3 sets of changes, so puberty, advanced thinking abilities, transition into new roles in society, biological, cognitive, and social, are the fundamental changes of adolescence. Importantly, they are universal changes, virtually without exception. All adolescents in every society go through these 3 categories that Hill suggested. So, biological transitions. The chief elements of the biological changes of adolescence, which collectively are referred to as puberty, involve changes in the young person's physical appearance, including breast development in girls, the growth of facial hair in boys, and a dramatic increase in the height for both sexes. and the development of the ability to conceive children. If we're going to define puberty, if you're taking notes, I would write that puberty is the biological changes of adolescence. We're going to look at all the biological changes that occur in early adolescence, examine how puberty affects the adolescent's psychological development and social relationships in later weeks of this course. So that's biological. So the onset of puberty, that's the first thing that Hill talked about. Then that second thing that Hill talked about was cognitive, right? So the emergence of more advanced thinking abilities, cognitive. So let's talk a little bit more about cognitive transitions. So the word cognitive refers to the processes that underlie how people think. Changes in thinking abilities make up the second of the three fundamental changes of adolescence. Compared with children, adolescents are much better able to think about hypothetical situations. So what's a hypothetical situation? That's things that have not yet happened but might, or things that may not happen but could. Okay, so adolescents are more able to understand this thinking hypothetically than if you were to try to give a hypothetical situation to a 7 or 8-year-old. Okay, so not just hypothetical situations, but also abstract concepts such as friendship, democracy, morality. Okay, so they're able to grasp these abstract concepts much better than a small child would be able to understand them. As we learn a little bit more about brain development in this course, you'll start to see how this happens and in what part of the brains and things, and what brain regions, what systems of the brain allow for this to happen. Okay, the last part is social, that John Hill talked about as one of the three features of adolescent development. So social transitions. All societies distinguish between individuals who are viewed as children and those who are seen as ready to become adults. It's like a universal thing. You're children, then you're an adult. Our society, for example, distinguishes between people who are underage or minors and people who have reached the age of majority. So we have a distinction in our society. Not until adolescence are individuals permitted to drive, marry, vote. Okay, so such changes in rights, privileges, and responsibilities constitute this third set of fundamental changes that occur at adolescence, these social changes. In some cultures, the social changes of adolescence are marked by a formal ceremony. There's some sort of rite of passage that takes place. At a later time, we're going to talk a little bit more about different types of rites of passage, but you might have in our society a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah or a 16 or a 15. There's different rites of passages depending on the culture, but around the world there seems to be some sort of ritual that often will take place between being a child and being an adult. In most contemporary industrialized society, the transition is less clearly marked, but a change in social status is a universal feature of adolescence. Okay, so it's more apparent in certain cultures than others, but there's still some sort of social transition, some sort of change in what your social rights are from being a child to being an adult. I want to quickly define rites of passage for you, and then after that, this lecture will be over, and you'll just continue exploring the course this week. Make sure you get through the checklist of the course and do all of the kind of exploring that I have you doing, like the discussion area and so on, the email, and take the quiz that will cover some of this lecture. And then we will get into more material next week when everyone has the book and everyone's had a chance to read. Okay, so rite of passage, let's define that. It's a ceremony or ritual marking an individual's transition from one social status to another, especially marking the young person's transition to adulthood. And I'm going to repeat that. It's a ceremony or ritual marking an individual's transition from one social status to another, especially marking the young person's transition to adulthood. See you on lecture 2. Bye.